Your Excellencies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone to today's AGDA virtual event titled MENA Economic Update Amidst Conflict Ended. I am Naif Al-Mansouri, a PhD student here at AGDA, and I'll be your MC for today's one-hour packed agenda focused on exploring the current MENA economic outlook, guided by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Roberta Gatti, Chief Economist of the Middle East and North African region of the World Bank. We began today's proceedings with a presentation led by Dr. Roberta Gatti to offer her profound insights and valuable perspectives on exploring the current MENA economic outlook. Dr. Gatti, the floor is yours.
Dear Nayef, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today, albeit online. And I'm very grateful for AGDA's invitation to have a discussion around the MENA economic outlook, which is a product that my office, the Middle East and North Africa Chief Economist Office at the World Bank, puts out twice a year with macroeconomic outlook for the region, as well as some themes of spotlight interest, which in this edition, which I'll be happy to share with you in the chat, is our conflict. And when one starts thinking about conflict, it's very difficult to think about something else, and public indebtedness. I also have a sort of concluding section of the presentation that brings together other themes that I see as concerning and very worthy of attention for the region that I'll be happy to discuss with you. But without further ado, let me start with the macro economic outlook. And here I hope that the computer, it works with me, and it did. So I wanted to highlight some of the key messages, and I might be spoiling the surprise, but hopefully this will give a sort of reading key for the presentation that you will see. The first part will talk about growth. And the main message there is that the MENA region, which for the World Bank goes from Morocco to Lebanon, including the GCC countries and Djibouti, but excluding Turkey, which, for example, is included in the definition of the MENA region for the IMF, is returning to pre-pandemic levels of low growth. In the presentation, you will see it as a return to lackluster growth, because this growth that we see for 2024 is really the prevailing growth of the decade before the pandemic. Second, we sort of delve in some of the apparent consequences of the conflict in Gaza, which are devastating on the Gaza Strip, are dramatic on the economy of the West Bank and Gaza, and also had some repercussion regionally and globally. Finally, we talk about debt. And why do we focus on debt? Because public debt is one of the measures of the ability of an economy to repay its liability. And in some of our countries, particularly the oil importing ones, public debt is high and needs to be addressed with a mix of, and that's what we'll recommend, not only fiscal discipline and debt transparency. So here I don't want to spoil the surprise, and I'll be delighted to walk you through what comes out of these exercises. But essentially what we see is that countries in MENA have been neither able to grow out of debt effectively nor to inflate it away. Now, let's start with the MENA economic outlook. So what you see here is something that speaks to me being a bit of a literature buff. And what we see is that what we had named the tale of two Menas has come to an end, and MENA is now returned to lackluster growth. In this graph on the left, you see the MENA region depicted in purple. You see emerging and developing economies depicted in yellow, and the world without the MENA region depicted in black. The solid line is the actual growth that we saw, and the dotted steady line is the growth that we saw on average for the decade preceding the pandemic. So what does this graph tell us? First of all, that the depth of recession in MENA was higher, and you see it in the purple, than in other emerging and developing economies in 2020 during the pandemic. What also happened is that if you focus on 2021, is that the recovery was more muted. But come 2022, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a combination of oil prices shooting up, supply side disruptions, you see a divergence between what happens in other emerging and developing economies and the MENA region. MENA was growing at a really substantial rate of 6%, while other emerging and developing economies were growing below 4%. There is a reversal of fortune in 2023, and this is essentially driven by the successive OPEC cuts on quantity. Something that will come apparent and that all of us working on MENA know is that what happens to the oil markets is really fundamental for the growth region in our, for the growth levels in our region. And maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about that later. But in 2023, the region grew at 1.9%, sorry, yes, 1.9%, which was quite a low rate, and then is expected and forecast to grow back at 2.7% in 2024, when there is an expectation that some of the brakes that have been put on oil production will sort of be lifted progressively in 2024. I said a tale of two Menas, and this is something that hopefully is more apparent in this graph on the right-hand side, where we actually break up the three groups in the region across GCC countries, which you see depicted in green, developing oil importers depicted in red. And here we sort of singled out Egypt because it's quite unique in its growth patterns, and developing oil exporters, this being Algeria, Iraq, and Iran. And I wanted to focus you on really the tale of two regions in 2022, where you see GCC countries shooting up at about 8% average growth, while the very same reasons that boosted growth in oil exporting countries were detrimental to oil importing countries, which were navigating the complicated environment of high uncertainty, high interest rates, and inflation, which was imported through high oil prices, increases in prices in fertilizers, and high food prices. Come 2023, the difference in these growth rates reduces, and this is where the tale of two regions ends, looking up towards a 2.7% of growth on average. Now, when I talk about 2024, I really talk about expectations, and I kind of wanted to be honest here, that expectations change over time. And any of you are familiar with publications such as Consensus Forecast, or even the World Bank or the IMF forecast, you see that they change over time. The World Bank issues essentially forecast 4 times a year, and we already saw a downgrade in growth expectations from January 2024 to now in April, when we issued our update, which are essentially connected to the geopolitical risk linked to the conflict. And what I wanted to point out here, and these are monthly revisions in forecasts from the Consensus Forecast publication, is that growth forecast went down for 2024 significantly starting October 7 for all the countries. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the repercussions that we are already witnessing from the conflict that is ongoing in the Middle East. Now, something that you might have heard about the world, and definitely is true for MENA, is that uncertainty is high. I heard it all the time, particularly since the pandemic. And I confess that I felt a little bit frustrated that this was a conversation, but I didn't really see measures of uncertainty in the literature. So my team developed a measure of uncertainty. And what they did is that they took all the forecast of growth from different forecasters, and there are tens of forecasters who are globally reputed to build forecasts for each country. They looked at each country, they took the difference between the minimum and the maximum of those forecasts, or in a different version of this measure, they took the difference between the 75 percentile and 25 percentile to really give a sense of how much discordance there is among the professionals and the experts about growth forecast. And they plotted that difference, the median of that difference in a graph. And guess what? The MENA region, which is also here depicted in purple, has uncertainty, which is measured in this way, which is significantly higher than other regions, comparators emerging and developing economies, and also high-income countries. So this uncertainty was already higher in MENA before the pandemic. It then shoots up for all the countries during the pandemic. It comes down. It is temporarily higher for other developing economies just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then it increases again for the MENA region just after the beginning of October. And you see it here on the right-hand side, and you see the conflict in Gaza as a sort of this line where that marks the significant increase of uncertainty in the region. So I was just in a panel yesterday, and the Minister of Economy of UAE gave a beautiful speech at the beginning to open the conference. And the key word with which he opened was uncertainty. And it really resonated with me because I can really see it also in the data. Now, let me turn to something that is very painful, but is very important also to understand from the economics point of view, which is the economic impact of the conflict. Clearly, nothing can capture the human cost and the human toll of this conflict. That said, there are important economic repercussions, and we try to capture some and put them out here because they will be important as we hope that a peace process will start soon, and we as an international community need to come together to think about reconstruction. So what you see on the left-hand side of this graph is the dynamics of real GDP growth in Gaza. And what you see starting on October 23 is a dramatic drop in growth, minus 86%. Essentially, it's like growth, as economic activity has come to a halt in the last quarter of 2023 in Gaza. On a yearly basis, this translates in a drop of GDP of 1/4 for Gaza alone. Now, GDP is one measure of economic loss, but there are different measures of economic damages. And my colleagues at the World Bank, not my office, but the team of infrastructure and social development, they've used satellite measuring to try to understand the cost of damage between October and January. And you see some measures of this damage assessment on the right-hand side based on the satellite data from the company Ipsos, which work with the World Bank. And essentially, the denominators of these percentages are different quantities, are the stock of housing, the stock of health facilities or schools. And it turns out that the damage only up to January has been estimated to $18.5 billion. And what you see here is that an increasing trajectory of this damage and then a leveling off, because unfortunately, only so little of this type of infrastructure is left to be destroyed. Of course, infrastructure doesn't even capture all the costs, many of which are really on the human side. And in the report, if you're interested, there is a discussion, a preliminary discussion of the impact that are going through phenomena such as malnutrition or starvation of children, and also mental health impact on the population. Now, I talked about the annualizing the loss on the GDP of Gaza, that 86% drop in the last quarter. And see here, what you see is that a comparison between that 25%, and you see it in red on the last vertical bar, and losses in other conflicts recent ones, these are the losses in the worst year of conflict in terms of GDP loss. So unfortunately, the conflict in the Middle East that is raging now in Gaza really compares to some of the worst economic losses that have been experienced in recent conflicts around the world. Now, the losses are not only in Gaza, but they really affect the West Bank as well. And so for the West Bank and Gaza, the World Bank has estimated a contraction of about 6.5% for 2023 and a similar contraction for 2024. And what is really going on in the West Bank is a sort of overlap of a public sector and a private sector crisis. In the public sector, because of the drop in clearance revenues that the State of Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority has been essentially unable to fully pay salaries of public employees. At the same time, the mobility of more than 200,000 workers who every day will go from the West Bank to Israel to work and who were earning more than 3 times the typical wage in in the West Bank, has stopped. And this has automatically generated a drop in demand, some of which also is connected to the inability of the PA to pay the salaries of its own employees. So both a public sector crisis and a private sector crisis that are really bringing together a deep recession for Gaza for the next year. Now, the impact of the conflict has not been limited to, as we know very well, to the West Bank and Gaza and the economy of Israel. And I need to be clear that the MENA region in the concept of the World Bank does not cover Israel. So you will not see here an analysis of the impact of conflict on Israel, though we all know that conflicts are expensive and damaging for people and economies everywhere. If we talk about regional impacts, to this day, they've been rather muted. They've been stronger in economies that have stronger ties with that part of the world, particularly on neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. These 3 countries, which were expecting a stellar year in tourism, have seen a drop in arrivals and a drop in revenues of tourism, which in some of them contributes to as much as 10% to GDP. So an important sector that suffered at the beginning. However, already in February, there were signs that tourism was already picking up. But if we were to look at just the forecast of Egypt, we know that it has been downgraded from January to April because the revenues from tourism and also the revenues from the Suez Canal has faced a drop. Why did I mention the Suez Canal? Because we all know about the attacks in the Red Sea, which have triggered a movement of shipment and goods away from the Suez Canal to the Cape of Good Hope. What happened there? On the left-hand side here, what you see is that there is an increase in shipping cost. And you see depicted in the blue line, which is the World Container Index, which picks up this cost. And these costs were sort of across the board. They increased worldwide. They increased particularly for the routes that went through Suez, such as the one going from China to Europe via the port of Genova. And you see that depicted in the red line. They went up significantly just after the attacks in December, but they started tapering down, fortunately, a little later. What happened there? Well, both times of delivery and related to that cost increased. If at any point in time you saw 9 ships traveling through the Suez Canal, now you would see 12 going via the Cape of Good Hope. At the same time, what has happened is that many of the contracts had been signed before these attacks. And so we haven't seen yet the full potential impact on prices. And post-pandemic, there has been a sort of investment in more shipping. So there was somehow capacity to deploy more ships and avoid scarcity, shortages of goods because of that abundance. Somehow, as an economist, I always like graphs and numbers. And so on the right-hand side, I felt it was kind of interesting to see how there was this specular movement of shipment that sort of dropped through the Suez Canal route and sort of increased through the Cape of Good Hope. Some of the implications for Egypt were serious because Egypt, as of January, was actually in a situation where it really benefited from hard currency. And during January alone, the revenues from the Suez Canal really halved for the country. Now, I spoke about potential global impacts, some of which went through the impact of shipping, but if we look at oil markets, gas markets, and capital markets, we don't see yet, we haven't seen yet massive impacts that reflected on the global situation from this conflict. Of course, the uncertainty is high, as I mentioned, and so I need to qualify everything that I'm saying with so far. And I also need to qualify the outlook that I presented in terms of the 2.7% growth forecast for the region with the assumption that these forecasts were built on the assumption that the conflict would not expand geographically, in which case there are different scenarios of how growth could unfold for the region and globally. Now, this conflict does not come in a region that was having an easy time economically. And this is where we look in depth into public debt as a way to capture one of these key vulnerabilities. So let me just put out a few elements from the analysis that we did in debt before I move up to what is usually my favorite section in this type of presentation, because there is the section of what keeps me up at night. I'm a true insomniac. And it's a section that really speaks to the sort of some of the key long-term challenges of the region. Now, why focus on that? Well, the main reason is that if we look at this graph on the right, I think that there are reasons of concern. Debt has increased all over the world, and we know about the conversation that have been held in different fora about debt restructuring. But look at what is happening to MENA oil economies and MENA oil importers. They have, in 2023, an average 88 debt to GDP ratio. That is extraordinary, particularly if we compare it to other emerging and developing economies, and particularly to oil importers. Two things to remember here. That has increased everywhere, and you see in the gradient from 2013 to 2023 in the past decade. However, it's notable that this increase in debt preceded the pandemic. Granted, the pandemic made things worse, and the pandemic increased debt to GDP ratio in the MENA region by 11 percentage points. So 11% of GDP was added to the debt because of the pandemic. This is kind of understandable. That was a moment where having an active government with policies that help people was fundamental, but debt increased. And there is an extraordinary variability of levels of debt within MENA. 88% is the average in 2023 for oil importers, 34% is the average in oil exporters. Now, maybe I will glaze a little bit on this section, but I just wanted to give you the sense of why we delved into this and what is the main intuition. Essentially, what we were trying to understand is how to answer two key questions that I heard a lot in the public policy debate. Well, aren't these countries growing out of debt? Question one. Two, well, there has been high inflation, and we know that inflation is essentially a transfer from creditors to debtors. So isn't that being inflated away? And I'm sorry to spoil the surprise, but the answer to both of these questions is no. And I just would like to give you the intuition here, and we'll move on to the sort of what keeps me up at night. And I'm happy to come back to any details if you're interested in, and feel free to put your questions in the chat and to convey them back to Dr. Damiana Bakarjikieva, who will be my partner in having a conversation with you. So if the debt to GDP ratio is this indicator of how much an economy is able to repay its own liability, what's in that number? What's in that ratio? Three things. First, debt stock, so how much debt increases. Second, how much GDP increases. That's the denominator. So if GDP goes up, the debt to GDP ratio should go down. And last, inflation. So if debt is issued in local currency and there is inflation, this debt becomes less and less burdensome. Okay, stay with this thought. And remember this purple part that we put there, which is the change in debt stocks. What determines those changes? You see it here. Four things. And I'll come back to these four concepts. There's no need for any math, but they're quite important. So what increases debt? Well, a fiscal deficit, if you have it, of the primary nature. So the primary balance, if it's in deficit. The debt interest payments increases debt because you need to service the past debt. Fluctuations in the exchange rate, because if you issue debt in dollars and your currency depreciates, your debt in local currency becomes more expensive to you as a government. And then there is that blue part, which is called stock and flow adjustments, which is other unexplained stuff. And something that we will get to is that the unexplained stuff in some countries is a very, very large quantity that explains a lot of why debt increased. I don't want to get into the details of these graphs, but I just want to give you a sense of the signs. If you have a primary surplus, your debt should decrease. If you have a lot of interest to pay on your debt should increase. If your currency depreciates, your debt should increase, your nominal debt stock should increase, and other factors can increase debt stocks. So let me just give you an intuition, and maybe focusing on Egypt would be the easier example, and you see it here on the right-hand side. So it turns out, and you see there in the colors, let me just move so that I can see myself. What happened in Egypt is that the increase in debt, which you see represented in the purple dot, and this is just debt stocks, was driven by three things. First one, interest payments. You see them represented in that sort of clay color. So Egypt is paying 8% of its GDP, 8% of its GDP in interest payments. Half of the collected government revenues of Egypt go to pay interest on the debt. That's a lot. It is as if half of my income went to go and pay for my mortgage on the house. That's really a lot of money. Second, you see that green part, and those are fluctuations in the foreign exchange rate. About 1/3 of the debt in Egypt is issued in foreign currency. The Egyptian pound had a significant devaluation from 15 to the dollar, I think at the beginning of 2023, and to 46 to the dollar a couple of weeks ago. And that made that foreign currency denominated debt more costly in local currency. And then you see the blue part, those stock and flow adjustments. It turns out that although Egypt has a primary surplus, and you see that orange drawing down the debt, contributing negatively to the debt because, it's a surplus, it's a fiscal surplus. It turns out that a lot of spending in Egypt is actually below the line, is extra budgetary. And so it's not captured by the fiscal surplus or deficit, but it's happening. And that's an important driver of debt, which I think is poorly understood. Let me sort of skip on this, but overall, I wanted to focus you on his two findings. The first one is that the strategy of growing out of debt in the Middle East and North Africa, and particularly oil importers, did not work out in the past 10 years. For every 1 percentage point of decrease in debt due to growth, almost half of that was made up again by increases in debt stocks. What were those increases in debt stocks? They were extra budgetary expenses, those stock and flow adjustments, and the fact that that became more costly for countries that had devaluation. Second, were countries able to inflate the debt away? And unfortunately, here again, the answer is no. For 1 percentage point of decrease in debt due to inflation, in the debt to GDP ratio due to inflation, almost all of that was recovered in terms of increases in debt stocks. Essentially, when inflation happens, it also drives, for countries that are in flexible exchange rate regimes, a depreciation of the currency, which makes the existing foreign currency denominated debt more expensive in local currency. So neither of these two strategies really helped out. So to kind of conclude this quick conversation on debt, the change in debt to GDP ratio can be seen as sort of driven by different elements, some of which reduce it and make it less burdensome, and some of which make it more burdensome. The changes in debt that eventually made it more burdensome for oil importing countries. Inflation and real GDP growth helped, but really not to the extent that they made debt reduce. So what's the solution? Fiscal discipline, but also debt transparency. And I'm really talking about these extra budgetary expenses, which in a country like Egypt, we saw contributed a lot to the increase in debt. Now, you might be wondering, yes, public debt is a vulnerability, but what's really is the economic intuition behind why debt is bad for economies? And this is where we go back to our sort of macro foundations. When government borrows from the economy, it's likely to increase interest rates. If interest rates increase, that means that the private sector faces higher costs to finance its own activity. And so that's kind of contractionary on the economy. Next, if the debt service and sort of paying interest rates is very costly, then the government has fewer resources to pay for essential spending. When I tell you that like half of the revenues of Egypt go to pay for interest rates on the debt, then we mean that really there's very little left for education, health, and all other policies that are essential to keep an economy healthy and going. And finally, there's also evidence from the macro literature that fiscal spending on the effect of additional fiscal spending on GDP, what we know as like the fiscal multiplier, tends to be lower when debt is high. So even fiscal policies become less effective. Now, let me stop here a moment, and I would be happy to go into a few things that keep me up at night, which really touch upon different themes: migration, climate change, social safety nets in the region. But let me give an opportunity here to Dr. Damiana to maybe stop me or ask questions or give me some sense of her direction. Dr. Damiana.
Thank you, Dr. Roberta. Once again, apologies for having to do this online, and we can't do anything about the weather. So unfortunately, we would have to wait for another opportunity to host you physically here at AGDA. I want to just ask you one quick question before we continue, which is, well, you've described an obviously uncertain and challenging environment that the whole region is operating in. For our audience, it's probably interesting to find out, how does the UAE economic outlook particularly compare to this overall pretty negative situation?
This is an excellent question, and let me try to unpack it in a couple of ways. Uncertainty is driven by many factors, some geopolitical that reflect also on potential uncertainty on oil markets. Something that is true for oil exporters is that traditionally they've been very concentrated on fuel and hydrocarbons. And so we have evidence that for them, the path of growth has been very volatile and their terms of trades have been very volatile. Once I had the privilege of having this conversation at the Ministry of Finance in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and what they said to me really resonated very powerfully. It is a painful way to grow. Now, if we think about the UAE, I think the UAE has been particularly successful in a policy of diversification away from fuels. And so if we look at what happened in 2023, there were these sort of oil cuts on quantities, but the economy of the UAE demonstrated significant resilience. I think that the growth that we estimate was 3.1, which exceeded significantly the GCC average. By contrast, an economy like Saudi Arabia went from growing to 8.7% or 8.6% in 2022 to minus 0.9 in 2023. So I think that diversification helped a lot the economy, the UAE economy. The UAE economy also had a significant robust performance in non-oil sectors, and that's exactly that type of resilience. I see it also happening in Saudi, and the larger that sector becomes, the less the economy will be exposed to the vagaries of oil prices. Something that I think also speaks to the resilience of the UAE economy is the fact that it has both strong fiscal and external balances. This is a country with surpluses on the fiscal side and surpluses on the current account and significant international reserves. Now, looking forward, I think that there are still some challenges and potential risk for the UAEs. The conflict is still ongoing in the region. And part of that uncertainty is that we're thinking about scenarios of whether the conflict will or will not expand geographically and will have geopolitical repercussions. And particularly escalation might have repercussions on the UAE. The second one, that even if the UAE has diversified very successfully, still a significant part of its exports, I think something like its economy is still 17%, or a little less than 20% of the economy is on fuel and oil production. We're all watching the oil markets. And the long-term trajectory of this oil market is one where both the supply has increased because new exporters of oil have come on the scene. The US with shale oil, Guyana, Brazil, Canada, but also the demand for fuel has decreased because of higher awareness of climate change. Alternative renewable sources of energy have become cheaper, and the willingness to pay of consumers is lower. So there is a sense in which this has been a very strategic and successful strategy for the UAE, but there is still some way to go. And let me conclude on one answer that I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has embraced very successfully, and that could be a further source of growth for the UAE. If we think about diversification, it's something that goes under the bucket of diversifying your endowment away from fuel and oil to another endowment, which I see under the big bucket of human capital. And if I think about human capital, there is a tremendous potential of talent, which is still underexploited, underused in the region, which is women's talent. So I saw the latest data that I saw for the Emirates on female labor force participation, put it, I think for nationals at around 33%, but I'd be happy to have a conversation with those who have better information and different access to data to understand where it's at. I know that in the Kingdom, it doubled up to about 36% through a very, very purposeful focus on reforms that eliminated restrictions for women to work at night, freed up women mobility through a number of reforms, and really invested in having women participate in the labor force, and not only participate, but even the employment rate of women went up just around the pandemic. So if I were to conclude there on one opportunity that I think lies ahead of the Emirates and the region at large is really to bring women in the labor force. But let me stop here to see if you have other questions on this first part, Damiana.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Dr. Sara Shihab is with us right now, but she's our expert on women in diplomacy and in general on gender issues. So if anything, I would most certainly put the two of you in touch. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. And I know that the UAE numbers have gone up as well, quite significantly. I don't have them on top of my head, but I'll be happy to share them with you. And I'm sure she has also more data than I do to share with you. Now, you mentioned a word that I want to catch up upon, and that's diversification. And this is clearly the main objective of the economic strategy of the UAE. And I know that you just last week got an award on the 30th annual conference of the ERF for your latest research on diversification and on the stages of economic diversification. I just wanted to ask you to very quickly guide us through the main takeaways of that research paper. It's quite technical, so we're not going to go into the technical details for the sake of our audience, but there's controversy in the literature as to whether diversification is a good or a bad thing for economic development, depending on different measures and different things that you take into account. So what did you find when you were looking at those particular links over, I think you went over 151 countries in a period of 57 years, so quite a broad spectrum of data.
Thank you, Dr. Damiana. And first of all, I wanted to say that this was a paper that is co-authored with Dr. Hoda Hassem and Dr. Daniel Lederman. So I wanted to share the kudos with them because it's been a pleasure to present at the Economic Research Forum conference in Rabat and to have the excellent comments that they gave us. So the paper, we called it like Economic Diversification Redux because it's a modest exercise. We really update a paper from 2003 of actually a friend and a former colleague, where we look at one very simple question. What happens to economic diversification or concentration, which one are the sort of specular of the other, as countries get richer? So imagine that you have a graph with the x-axis, you have GDP per capita, so how countries get rich over the years. And on the y-axis, you have a measure of concentration, like a Gini coefficient of the economy. So what we find is that looking over these about 60 years and sort of looking at all the sectors of the economy as they are defined in UNIDO, which is a typical source of intersectoral industrial production, is that if we look at all countries in the world, and here we have data for 151, rich and developing, countries tend to follow a U-curve. So they diversify as they grow from being poor to kind of middle income, and then they reconcentrate their industrial production. So this is in line with what these authors, they are Eames and Bakhtiar, and that paper was published on the American Economic Review, so really like the top journal in the profession found 20 years ago. The advantage of our data is that they had 60 countries and we have 151. So the landscape of data has improved significantly and we can cover a longer period. So that's what happens. First, diversification and then reconcentration. But something that we find and that contradicts their result is that instead of being a path that we witness over time, consistently across countries, is really something that is driven by initial differences in the structure of these countries. So it's not that like, as I get rich year after year, I get more diversified. There's something about the initial condition of these countries that makes them more likely to be more diversified or less diversified. Now, we're going to go like, okay, what is that? What are those characteristics? And we look at one in particular, which is being resource rich or resource poor, which we kind of felt it was important for at least two reasons. First of all, because globally, the climate change imperative really makes us think about what are the strategies for countries that are oil and fuel dependent for diversification. Second, coming from Mena, I really felt this is about my countries. I want to understand what happened. So that both resource rich and resource poor countries have this U curve. So they diversify, they get a little richer and concentrate. Resource rich countries, which here we find in a way that is consistent with the trade literature as next holders of resources, and only oil, but includes mineral oil, mineral ore, and copper, like that. They much earlier. So they diversify income and they reconcentrate much earlier. So we find patterns of significant concentration across these countries. And this is up to a couple of years back. So now what we really underscore is that the pattern has been of reconcentration. We don't look at the service sector because it doesn't exactly compare to what we have. But once we control for the service sector, we still see this pattern of reconcentration. It could just be, you know, they diversify into the service sector, and so we don't see it in industry. It turns out that the size of the service sector does not make a difference. So our policy message from this rather technical paper is really that more emphasis needs to be put on diversification for countries that are resource rich. How to do it? There are different strategies. If we think about our countries, something that they have pursued, I think, successfully is to diversify through sovereign wealth funds. That's one way to diversify the proceeds of your concentrated endowment and invest it in activities that are not correlated with what happens to oil. Another way is to adopt industrial policies. Invest in tourism, pick sectors that you think are successful. And that has happened, and it continues to happen with different degrees of success, but in some countries very successfully. And thirdly, is to kind of let markets forces work and investing in changing the endowment. And that's where we go back to that story of female labor force participation, but also of improving the skills of your population. And I know that many of our countries are really thinking about education strategies and how to improve the skills of the population so that they are ready for this very rapidly changing world of work. But let me stop here. It was a lot of work, which I tried to sort of condense in a couple of minutes of story. So
thank you for doing it so excellently. We have a couple of questions. I do have a million other questions, but we can keep those for a later discussion between you and me. I would like to glance through the chat and ask you one or two of the questions of the audience. The first one of them, going back to the debt discussion, is from our colleague Mustafa Bayoumi, who is the head of our Climate Diplomacy Center. And what he's wondering about is what is the potential for debt for climate swaps in the MENA region? And if you have any idea which countries would be the best place to benefit from such tools, is that something that could be put in place?
So this is an excellent question. And I saw also another question that is related to that in the slide, in the chat. So if that's okay, Dr.
Yeah.
Damian, I try to answer them both together.
Perfect. Is high debt always bad? Was the other question.
Correct. Okay. So I think I'm going to be an economist here, and I'm going to say it depends. Because, sorry, I had to. So think about that as something that you can use to implement counter-cyclical fiscal policies. I'm going to try to unpack something that for economists is kind of like, that's what you ought to do, counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But essentially, if you are in a recession and you have fewer revenues and you need to sort of reactivate the economy, you might want to use fiscal policy. Where are you going to get the money if you're in a recession? When you are in a recession, also your revenues go down. So you might even be less able to implement fiscal policies. So what do? You borrow. And so that's one good way to use debt, is to sort of bring in resources in the economy when things are bad and repay it back when things get better. Now, high debt is not a good thing when you are in an economy where the various indicator of the economy, you know, how much our currency comes into debt, the type of composition of the debt, how the proceeds, how the debt is, what the debt is being used for, don't bode well in terms of an economy that grows more than what it needs to pay to borrow. Let me translate that for the economist in the audience. If we think about that sustainability, which might be behind some of this question, one of the key conditions that need to be fulfilled is that in the long run, R minus G should be, well, G minus, you should grow faster than the rate of interest that you put on the debt. Essentially, your income should grow faster than the service of the debt. If you think about it, a family, I think it becomes very easy, that metaphor of like, you need to have income enough to pay for the interest on the mortgage of your home. In some of our countries, it turns out that in the past years, and this doesn't mean forever, high debt was associated with public investment that have not shown, and I would like to be optimistic and say, yet, the type of returns that warranted the use of so much debt. And so that's in that case where you see that high debt is concerning. And that's where you want a government that sort of commits itself to a path of fiscal consolidation, which could be being more efficient on spending, but could also be more efficient in collected domestic revenues. If you look at like the rate of collection of domestic revenues in high income countries, you know, revenues to GDP are anywhere between 30 and 40% of GDP. In our countries, they teeter along like 15%, 20%, 22%. So governments can do better also in collecting revenues. There was a very interesting question about the debt swap and the green economy. So let me just be honest here. I'm not an expert in this, but I see that there's a great potential for our countries. And I saw already Egypt that has already embraced this strategy, because looking forward is really looking towards a green growth strategy. And that's one way in which it can sort of redirect its own debt. Let me conclude on the fact that developing countries don't really need to think about either I grow or I grow green, because for many developing countries, this not being the case probably of UAE, they still have to sort of fully expand access to electricity and access to energy sources. And so as they do that, they have an opportunity to really nudge the policies and the actions toward green growth and sort of renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. So I think the answer is that high debt always bad? I would say it depends, and it depends on really the intrinsic and structural capacity of the country to repay, which depends on many factors. But I try to explain how to be sustainable and definitely there's great potential for climate change, that swap, climate-related debt swap in the future.
Thank you very much. We have less than 5 minutes left of our allocated time. Can I ask you to maybe pick one of those things that keep you up at night and tell us what it is?
Happily. So first, let me put, I think I managed to find the report on the website, and so I added it in the chat for our audience. And I'm so flattered that so many of you have managed to connect also on a day of uncertainty. This time it was about the weather. But let
Thank you
me
very
go back.
much.
I don't know if I'm sharing my screen with the Mena economic update, but let me go back to the presentation here.
No,
And
we're
so,
seeing the presentation still.
are
So
you
that's
seeing the
okay.
presentation? So let me pick one, and then if I can, maybe two. So let me pick climate change, which is kind of like a different way to look at what we were talking about on the green, on the debt. So here, looking at the region at large, and something that concerns me a lot is the fact that our region, and I'm Italian, so I'm not from the region, but I consider myself, I consider this my region. Is my 7th year of working in the region, and I care. So I'm worried about climate shocks being more frequent, increasingly more frequent in the region, and much more costly than we see in the rest of the world. So here you see the climate shocks related to, droughts, floods, storms, landslides, and we're just coming from a storm advisory today here, which was even costly for a country that is so rich and so well organized 2 weeks ago as the UAE, but all countries in the region are the UAE. So, these are really dramatic events in countries that also have less resources to be resilient. And we see that these shocks are more costly than for the rest of the world, more frequent, and they are more costly than the rest of the world. And I see this in this sort of exposure to shock as something that is connected to the sort of geography of the region, the fact that the land is more arid than in other regions. We know that by 2050, the region will go below the minimum requirement of water per person. So this is a water scarce region. I'm not saying anything new, but these realities make it also more costly for these shocks on the economy. And let me put like an angle that is very important for the World Bank, which is the distributional one. These shocks tend to be more devastating for vulnerable families. And so I see there an important agenda, not only on mitigation, which is the moving away from fossil fuels for more resilience on the economic side, and for doing our part to not contribute to further climate change shocks, but also an important agenda of adaptation, of building resilience in rural areas, of thinking about vulnerable populations who might be displaced. And if I might say so, sometimes women end up being the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And so there needs to be a strategy that makes sense of our increasing economic resilience of the economic ecosystem around the areas that are more exposed, but also cash transfer and the ability of countries to respond rapidly to help these families. So I have more reason to stay up at night, and maybe that's why I'm an insomniac. But let me conclude here and turn back to you, Dr. Damiana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberta. Again, I really, really wished we had you physically here and we could continue that conversation outside our auditorium and have a chat with all of the audience that I'm sure have plenty of questions. But for the sake of everybody's schedules, I think we're going to end here by thanking you very much for being so flexible and joining us today online and doing this presentation online. And we really look forward to having you with us very soon in the very near future.
Thank you, Dr. Damiana.
Thank you
It was
very
a
much.
pleasure, and I'm really delighted that so many of you connected. And we issue this report twice a year. The next one will be in October, and it will be on growth. And we will be thinking about growth strategies for the region. So if you're interested in that, I'll be delighted. And if the weather collaborates, then I will finally have a chance to actually meet you in person, and it will be my pleasure to do so.
Well, we are victims of climate change like everybody else, but let's hope
Very
that
true.
things in October are better than now.
Very true. Thank you so much, and see you all soon. Thank you for
Thank
connecting.
you very
Thanks
much.
for
Thank
having
you
me.
to all of
Bye.
your attendees and guests. So we are very happy to have had you with us, and looking forward to future events here at AGDA.
Thank you.